Hello students, in this lesson, more than you learning when the bishop is better than the knight or when the knight is better than the bishop, we're going to learn how to use this information to make decisions and win our games. This is extremely important because along with the material from lesson number 52, these are two of the main components of chess strategy and we have to get it the right way, guys. So this is going to be a long lesson, so make sure that you have your favorite drink next to you just like you did for lesson number 52. Make sure that you pay attention and that you go over all of this material. It is extremely important and I think that you're going to like this one more than what you learned in lesson number 52, simply because many of the rules that I'm going to give you, many of the concepts, they're going to allow you to make a decision in a second and change the direction of the game. What you learned in lesson number 52, it requires more preparation, more time, but many of these rules that you're going to learn, like the one that you're going to learn from this position, which I think is one of the most important rules that you're going to learn, this could help you make a decision in a second and alter the entire game. So we're gonna get to it, and this is what we're going to do. We're going to start with a position as simple as this, and we're going to finish with a more complicated position like this one that you have in front of you. Now, in between these two positions, guys, I'm going to be giving you a lot of material for you to really understand these concepts, these rules, and how to use them to get better games. So get ready. We have a long way to go. If you're just here to know if the bishop is better than the knight or if the knight is better than the bishop, you can see this information that I put on the sides. That's enough for you to have it. So I'm not going to go over it now. We're going to go over it as we go through these positions that I'm going to show you. So if you're just here for homework or a research paper, there you have the information. If you're here to really understand how to use it, then stay tuned because again, we have a long lesson ahead of us. So let's take a look at this position first. And actually, let me remove these pawns first. Let's get things done the right way. So if you look at a position like this, guys, and by the way, just to make this a little bit better, guys, I need you to take a look at this position again, and I need you to write down, ideally you put it, guys, in the comment section of this video. Just write down in one sentence what your plan is and what your next move would be. Now, if you don't want to put it in the comments, I'll really appreciate it because it gives me an idea of what you guys need, what you need to reinforce, where you guys are at. So if you could put it in the comments, excellent. If you don't want to do it, write it somewhere else or just keep it in mind. I need you to remember this because at the end, after we go over all of this material, I'm going to ask you to do the same thing. If you put it in the comment, you could at the end reply to that comment, and I want to see how your plan and your next move changed after you look at all of this. So let's get started here. First thing that you have to understand before we start with this is that the first thing that I learned whenever they talk to me about this subject is that the bishop is better when the position is open like this. There are no pawns to get in the way of the bishop to restrict the bishop. And the knight, I knew that the knight was better when the opposite happened, when the position was closed. If there are pawns in the center, the bishop is not so good, the knight could jump over those pawns and so on. So that's the picture that I had in my mind. But of course, there's so much more to it, and that's exactly what we're going to learn here. But I need you to understand that an open position means there are no pawns in the way of the bishop that could block the bishop. Closed means that there are pawns stuck in the center and making things difficult for that bishop. So with that in mind, let's take a look at a position like this where we have the same amount of pawns on the same side of the board. So this is almost identical. We just have bishop versus knight. Now guys, regardless of anything else, this is going to be hard to prove that one piece is better than the other. This is just going to be a draw. And the simplest way to think about this is that even if one of the sides wins one of the other side's pawns, it's easy for the other person to just trade their minor piece for that extra pawn because we know king and bishop is not enough to do checkmate. So in other words, if the black pieces took these two pawns and the white pieces managed to take the three of them, even if I have a passed pawn, the knight could be easily sacrificed for that pawn and we cannot do checkmate with king and bishop. So again, this should be a pretty easy draw. It's hard to prove anything. Now, if we added more pawns, so I'm going to add pawns on the other side. This is when things get complicated for the player with the knight. Guys, the main thing that I want you to get from these positions, and if you just get this out of this lesson, I'm more than satisfied because this is very common to get in your games, and if you know these little things from the end game, it could affect the way you play the opening and the middle game. You could be playing your middle game thinking of the end game that you might get and steer the position, make decisions to steer the position into an end game that you're familiar with and you know you're going to be better. So the whole point here is that the bishop, if you put it, let's say, on d4, or if I put it on c3, the bishop is going to be very easy for that piece to control both sides of the board. The knight, not so much. The knight has a hard time transferring from one side of the board to the other side of the board. So if I'm the side with the bishop, guys, and I get to an endgame like this, I want to keep pawns on both sides of the board. So you see, just knowing this piece of information is going to allow you to make decisions that are going to make the game easier or harder for you. If I'm the person with the knight, I really want to trade pawns from one side. So if I just trade these pawns for these pawns, my knight is going to be able to just focus on this side. He doesn't have to be having a hard time transferring from one side of the board to the other side. So you see, one rule, if bishop is better when there are pawns on both sides. So this could help you make decisions and make the game simpler. Now, this is more complicated for the knight, but it could be a draw. It's not so easy for the side with the bishop to win this game. Now, the main thing for the side with the bishop, guys, is to create strategic imbalances, and that could be something like this. If we just remove a pawn from the black pieces and we remove a pawn from the white pieces, you see this is an imbalance. There's a pawn majority on this side, pawn majority on this side, and the point is that this is going to allow us to create a pass pawn, and at the end of the day, the bishop again is going to be superior because from here, my bishop could help that pawn get to the end, and it could also control the promotion square or simply control that pass pawn just from being here sitting on c3. The knight has to go crazy from one side to the other. The knight cannot help that much. So again, if I'm the one with the bishop, I want to keep pawns on both sides, but more than that, I want to create imbalances. Now, if I remove another pawn from each side, this is strategically won for the white pieces. I already have the pass pawn. I don't even have to worry about creating the pass pawn. It's already there. And again, I could easily control this one and I could support my own pawn. So guys, this is what I wanted you to get from this position. There's of course more that you're going to learn, but this is in essence something that is really, really important. You don't know how many times I've got into a position to an endgame and I'm just looking at this. Okay, I have a bishop. I want to keep pawns on both sides. I have a knight. I want to get rid of pawns from one side to make it easier for me. So again, extremely important that you keep this in mind. Okay, so take a look at this other position. Here, one thing to keep in mind is the position open or closed. As you can see, there are no pawns in the center. This is an open position and the white pieces should be better. Number one, open position, bishop better than the knight. Number two, there are pawns on both sides of the board. Now, if you add to these guys other factors like an active king, open files for the rooks, things could get even more powerful. So in this position, the first move that the white pieces did was bishop b3. Then we have knight to f6. And then after king g2, look, just trying to activate the king, get to the center, we have rook takes e1. Rook takes back, and now rook e8. Okay, guys, so quick question for you. What do you think is better? This combination of bishop and rook, or this combination of knight and rook? Well, this is another well-known rule. Bishop and rook are better than knight and rook. So even though it makes sense to keep the rook on the board because we have this nice combination, there are other factors, and in this game, they actually went rook takes rook, knight takes rook. Now, the reason why the white pieces traded the rook is number one, more than that, we need to activate the king, and that black rook was going to be cutting the king. And also, it's a little bit concerning that the rook could get to the 7th rank. So we just traded that, and now we get into this endgame that should be pretty easy for the white pieces. The king is closer to the center. We're going to be putting a lot of pressure. And again, bishop versus knight, open position, pawns on both sides. So after the knight went to e8, we have king f3, just trying to activate the king quickly. Then king f8, king e4, knight c7, so they're not letting us get into the queen side, but that's fine. Guys, this is another thing. Our bishop needs weak pawns to put pressure on. So we cannot get onto the queen side, that's fine. We're going to try to create weaknesses on the king side. And again, if we have weaknesses on both sides, the bishop could easily transfer from one side to the other and help us. So at this point, after knight c7, we just go h4. Again, trying to create weaknesses. So after h4, king e7, then we have pawn to f4. Notice how we're keeping the pawns on the opposite color of the bishop. And this is something that we're going to talk more in a moment. So after f4, h6. Now bishop c4, this is something that we have talked about before. A very important principle, guys. It could help you a lot. Bishop likes to be 2 squares away from the knight, because that way we keep the knight under control. So this, even if you're playing blitz, you have a few seconds left, it's always a good rule to keep the bishop two squares away from that knight. So after bishop c4, we have knight e6, then pawn to g4, we have everything under control. Then we have knight c7. Notice how the knight is just going back and forth, going to c5 for that check. It's just not gonna get them anything. So now we have king e5. We're trying to penetrate, and we know that f6 is coming. Now guys, this is just a 6-1 position for the black pieces, meaning that they just don't have any moves. So after f6, I'm going to go king e4. Now king f8, and after king f8 we have pawn to h5. Now this is a very delicate move, because remember, we don't want to put our pawns on the same color of the bishop. Instead, it makes more sense to do something like this. Put our pawns on the opposite color, because then we fix their pawns on the color that our bishop is. So our bishop could go after that pawn later and put pressure on it. However, this is more about getting our king to penetrate and put pressure. So by doing h5, we're looking for ways for our king to go in. So after h5, they just went g5, and now f takes. They have to take with the f pawn, or they let us get a pass pawn. So f takes, and now guys, we can go king f5, king g6, king h6. Now we know the black pieces could easily block us, but that's fine, because more than that, we just wanted that king to get closer here. That way he's further away from the queen side. So king goes to g7, that's perfectly fine. And now our king comes to e5. So knight e8, that knight doesn't have much to do. So bishop e6, then knight f6, trying to put pressure on g4. And now we have pawn to b4. Now guys, this is another rule. You have to pay attention to your opponent's pieces. Do they have any counterplay, anything that we have to be careful with? No? Then when we have everything perfectly prepared, then we're going to move in and attack. So before we send our king over, it is a good idea to get our pawns moving and get them closer to the end. Because by the time we get these pawns, our pawns are just going to be pretty close to promotion. So b4 is happening, knight e8. So the knight wants to keep an eye on the queen side as well. And then b5. Now, another move that might be a little bit weird, because we're putting our pawn on the same color as the bishop. But in this case, there's another factor that is more important. We learned in lesson number 62, I think, guys, the concept of one pawn that stops two pawns. And this is extremely important. Not to mention that the knight just cannot attack that pawn. It's not easy for them to collect that pawn. So after b5, we have knight going back to f6, then a4, just getting our pawns close enough. So knight e8, they just have, this is what 6-1 looks like, guys, for the black pieces. In this case, they just have no good moves. They're just waiting there, back and forth. So after knight e8, bishop f5, notice how they're not going like crazy with the king. They don't want to mess this up. So after bishop f5, knight f6, the king goes to e6, knight e8, bishop e4, knight f6, and now look at this, bishop f3, 2 squares away from the knight. You're gonna see this pattern over and over, and I'm glad that we're reinforcing this. So after bishop f3, again, that knight is under control, and then they just went knight to g8, again, just going back and forth. Finally, we go for those pawns on the queen side. So after king d6, king f6, king c6, king e7, king b7, those pawns are ours. King d6, And now we finally get the first pawn. So after we take, guys, king c5, notice how now the only piece protecting that pawn is the knight, is the king. So that king is tied up to the defense of that pawn. After they went king c5, we have king a6, knight f6, bishop c6. Look, 2 squares away from the knight. Guys, we're trying to just do a5 to get this guy out of the way, and we just promote. So this should be enough to win the game. So bishop c6, we don't want that knight to come to the queen side. If they take the pawn, they get a passed pawn. But again, our bishop from far away could support our pawns on this side, and it could control any passed pawn. So now a5, that's the plan, b takes, and then pawn takes b6. We don't really mind if they take, because then we have b7 and we promote. Even if they go king c7, king a7, and this knight, you see, the knight is not like the bishop. The knight needs a few moves to get over and help. So now we're going to promote, guys. We get our queen, and we win this game. Now, if we go back, notice how by just knowing a few things, it allows you to win, to get a more comfortable endgame, guys, and win. So maybe if you don't do it this perfectly, even if your technique is not so good, just knowing that an endgame like this, the bishop is going to be superior, it just makes it so much easier for you to play this position. So just keep these rules at the back of your head. Remember how they tried to bring in the king also to the center, the reason why they traded rooks. All of these little things, they're going to come handy in your game. So let's get to the next position. Now, guys, for this position, I'm not going to show you the entire, like the remaining of the game, but I'm going to do something that I think could be as good or even better. I'm going to tell you what the plan is for the white pieces here. Now, I'm focusing on the white pieces because it should be obvious by now that in this position, the knight is going to be better than the bishop. Notice how the center is not so open as before. The bishop is not as flexible. So this has to be a better position. Now, on top of that, we know that the knight is better when the knight has access to key squares like these ones that cannot be attacked by the bishop. And this is very important, guys. The knight needs pawns to help him to get to those squares and stay there. So in this position, needless to say that the knight is better than the bishop. So what is the plan here for the white pieces? First of all, we want to find a way to centralize our king. So remember, even if you put your knight on one of these squares, just putting the knight there is not going to get you to win the game. We need to activate our king. We need to use other factors. So we want to activate the king. Also, we want to get rid of one of the rooks, and this is very important. Why do we want to do this? Well, if we don't, they're going to double up the rooks. They're going to get to the 7th rank, so our king is not going to be so safe out there. So trading one of the rooks is really, really important. But more than that, ideally, we would trade the rook on e2. Because if they take, we take with the knight, and that knight is ready to get to d4. Now, once we have our knight on d4, or even on e5 and the king on d4, we want to start using that knight to push the pawn to b4, to b5, and then get our own passed pawn. Now, guys, one of the reasons why I'm not going too deep into this position is because we talked a lot about this in lesson number 52. If you haven't, you must go to that lesson and review it, because it's a lot about how the knight could use this outpost and how the knight could be better than the bishop in many positions. So with that said, let me just show you the first few moves. I'm not going to show you the entire game, but this is a game played by Botvinnik, and here he just went rook f to e1, then we have rook e8, and of course he got rid of one of the rooks. Notice that it was not ideal like doing it on e2, but hey, we have to just get that done. So after they took back, the kings start getting out towards the center, and now we have rook d1. This is the other thing that I wanted you guys to see. We have to always make sure that this pawn structure remains fixed as it is, because if not, the bishop is going to get active, and then it's not going to be so bad for them. So rook d1 is necessary just to control this, and in the meantime, we get our knight around and take care of that. So after rook d1, we have rook e8, then rook d2, trying to trade again the rook over here, but also we're keeping an eye on the 2nd rank just in case. So pawn to h6, then rook e2, you see, if they take, knight e2, knight e4, the rook came over to b8, and now we just go king e3. Guys, again, I'm not going to show you the entire game, but now you get the idea. You understand how in this position, just for being like this, the knight is better, but also because the knight has access to key squares that the bishop cannot control. So I'm going to leave this one here and let's go on to the next position. Okay guys, so this position along with the next three positions that you're going to see, we're not going to even go over the first few moves. I just want you to tell me if you like to be the white pieces or the black pieces, which is the same thing as saying, do I want to be the guy with the bishop or do I want to be the guy with the knight? So take a moment. If you want, just think about it. What would you rather be? The bishop, or would you rather have the knight? Well, in this position, guys, this was actually a game played by Bobby Fischer in the candidate tournament of 1971, and he was playing with the white pieces, and needless to say that the white pieces are better. So this is more of an open position. The bishop should be better than the knight. I don't want to show you the entire thing, but just for you to know, the first two moves were bishop f1, putting pressure on that pawn. b5 is not possible, so they have to go a5, so that makes our bishop even better. And then they went bishop c4. See, that bishop went from g2, from this diagonal, he transferred it to this diagonal, putting pressure on f7. The only way to protect it is by rook f8, and notice how this rook is now extremely passive. This is just not good. After we go over the next few positions, we're going to go to the final position that I wanted to show you guys, and hopefully it gets you to understand this concept even more. Okay, next position, would you rather be the white pieces with the knight, or would you rather be the black pieces with the bishop? Alright guys, if you pause the video and you thought about your answer, the right decision here is that the knight is superior to the bishop. I know that the bishop looks pretty active here, but notice how the knight has a very good square on e5, even on c5, and these are squares that the bishop cannot control, and we have a pawn to support that knight. So this game went on to be a victory for the white pieces. Of course, there's a lot that you have to get right here, but just for you to know, this position should be better for whites. And also another thing is that this pawn in the center, the pawn that is fixed, is the same color as the bishop. So what that does is it takes squares away from this bishop, right? Okay guys, this one is pretty similar to the one we had before. The position is pretty open. Bishop and rook is a better combination than knight and rook. So this should be a better game for the white. All right, this position is taken from lesson number 52. Again, I keep talking about that lesson, but you should know, if you pause the video to think about it, fine, but you should know, guys, that this is a better position for the white pieces because the center, of course, is locked. This is a closed position, and there's a very good outpost for that knight, which cannot be attacked by the bishop. So this is definitely a better position for the white pieces. Now guys, this last position, I'm going to actually show you the entire game because I want you to see how they transition from the opening to the middle game, from the middle game to the end game, but always thinking about this concept of the bishop versus knight or knight versus bishop, always paying attention to the minor pieces. So we're gonna get to it. Now is a good moment, if you're trying to do this right, to reply to your comment or just think about your plan again, what your plan is, what your next move is as the white pieces. So this position, as you can see, is it open? Is it closed? Is it better to try to keep your bishop? Is it better to keep your knight? And this is very important because we have talked about the rule of simplification, and we typically talk about it in terms of if you're winning in material, you should simplify the game. It's going to make it easier for you. But this rule of simplification goes beyond that. Like it also has to do with the pieces that you want to, not so much the pieces that you want to simplify and remove, but the pieces that you want to leave on the board. So do I want to leave my knight versus his knight, my knight versus his bishop, my bishop versus his bishop, my bishop versus his knight? So these are things to keep in mind. So I'm going to show you the entire game. Let me go back to the first move, which was knight f3. And by the way, guys, this is a classic. This is a very popular game. So after knight f3, knight f6, we have pawn to c4, d5, c takes d5, knight takes d5, pawn to d4, g6, pawn to e4. So look at this, very strong center. The knight went back to f6, putting pressure on e4, knight c3, bishop g7, and now we have this interesting move, which is h3. Now guys, h3, the main reason for this move now is because we know that bishops are better in open positions, and the white pieces are already thinking of keeping their bishops. They want to do bishop e3 without having to worry about knight g4 to remove that bishop. But we also know, especially if you have gone over the lessons about the perk defense, that in positions like this, it's not the same, I know, but in positions like this, bishop g4 could be really useful for black to undermine d4, since the knight is defending d4. So h3 is a very useful move, and it makes a lot of sense. But notice how from now, they're thinking about keeping their bishop. So after the black piece is castled, we have bishop e3, pawn to c6, queen to d2. So we also are familiar with this pattern. We know that they want to go to h6 and remove this powerful bishop. Now, rook e8, bishop d3, and knight b to d7. This is a critical moment, guys, and I wanted to talk about it just for a moment because we know that the black pieces, the strategy is to undermine our center, and this is something else that we talked about when learning about the perk, and they want to do it with pawn to e5. If they do that, not only do they undermine our center, but they could use our e4 pawn as target to put pressure on it. So we have to prevent that. And the move that the white pieces did was a very powerful move, which is pawn to e5. But there's something that I wanted to say about this move. Whenever you push a central pawn, for the most part, you want to do it, guys, only if you are attacked by another pawn. So that way you don't leave weaknesses. Now, when they do e5, notice how d5 is weaker. We don't have control over it anymore. Now, in this case, it is fine because this knight can only go to d5. And when we take, they have to take with the pawn, so this square is not going to be weak or available for them to use. It is going to be occupied by a pawn. So that's why we want to only push when they attack us with a pawn. That way that pawn remains there and no one can access that square. So in this case, it turned out to be fine for white, but I wanted to highlight that. Very important principle for you to keep in mind. So after c takes d5, we finally castle, and now the black pieces don't like this. They went pawn f6. So they know that if we just take, this is going to be a very equal position. We both have isolated pawns. We have the same minor pieces, even though the white pieces are a little bit more active. It's not a big deal. So that's the reason why the white pieces did not take on f6. Instead, they just went bishop h6. Now, this is very smart. We're trading our bad bishop for this really important bishop. Guys, this is the bad bishop because if you look at the pawns in the center, especially the most advanced pawn, this pawn is the same color as our bishop. So this makes our bishop a bad bishop. It doesn't have that much flexibility. Our good bishop is going to be this one that is pretty open and pretty active. So bishop h6 makes a lot of sense. And now we have f takes e5. Now, we've talked in the perk and the king's Indian defense, we've talked about this plan of saving the bishop. It's so important that we want to keep it. But in this case, it does not work because there is a tactic. See if you can figure it out. Feel free to pause the video and see if you can find why bishop h8 loses material for the black pieces. Well, the move here, guys, would be e6, and when the knight moves, we have bishop b5. Even if the knight had gone somewhere else, the rook couldn't go there because of this bishop. So they're losing material. So they had to go ahead and take on e5. The white pieces remove the bishop finally, and now d takes e5. All right, guys, if we take a look at this position, if you evaluate this position, this is what we had before. The main thing that should come to mind is this nice square on d4. And this square cannot be accessed by any minor pieces other than this knight. So that means that if I remove this knight with my bishop, I'm going to be left with knight versus bishop, and that bishop cannot access d4. So I'm already thinking of the rule of simplification. It looks like a very standard position, and many strong players, guys, when I show them this position, they just cannot find the right plan. They just don't even pay attention to this factor. So if you get the hang of it, it is going to improve your game a lot. So again, the strategy here, the plan is to is to trade our bishop for a knight and be left with a knight versus bishop, and it should be a way easier game for the side with the knight. And I know in this position it is the black pieces to move, but I wanted to know, guys, if you think of these ideas and think of the move bishop b5, because it's very easy to now get rid of that knight, followed by knight d4, and again, very comfortable position for the white pieces. So instead, it's black pieces to move here, and they did knight to c5. Do we care if they take the bishop? It's a very nice bishop, but we welcome them to actually take it. So instead, the white pieces went knight to d4, they went knight e6, and now quick question for you. Would you guys trade knight takes knight? Well, the answer is no. Remember, our plan is to keep the knight versus the bishop. So we have to walk away from there, and they went knight e2. Now rook f8, coming to a better file. Pawn f4, not only expanding, guys, but protecting e5. So queen b6 check, king goes to h2, then knight d4. Look, would you guys trade or no? Well, if you've been paying attention, of course we're not going to trade the knight. We want to keep this knight. So knight c3, avoiding the trade of knights. Guys, many people, you show them this and they have no idea why they don't want to take the knight. Well, we know our plan, we know what we have in mind. So after knight c3 hitting d5, we have pawn e6, and now this bishop gets even worse than ever before. The two pawns in the center are on the same color as the bishop. The bishop is pretty limited now. So after pawn to e6, rook a to d1, now we're even threatening to do a discovered attack on the knight. So knight f5 happened, and now what would you do? Pretty obvious. This is what we have been trying to do the entire game. So it's bishop takes f5. Finally, we're left with knight versus bishop. So rook took, and now where do we want to put the knight? Well, that knight could quickly get to d4. So knight e2, and there's nothing they could do to prevent us from going to d4. So bishop d7, finally developing the bishop, knight d4, the rook goes to f7, and now, guys, once you have the knight in the center, you should know this from lesson number 52, we have to start putting pressure on the flank. So once the center is locked under control, you want to attack on the flanks. This is a rule. And typically the person that controls the center is going to be the person able to win. So we can actually, the knight from here is safe and putting a lot of pressure on both sides of the board. The bishop cannot do so much. So after knight d4, h4, we want to start creating weaknesses on the king side. Rook a to f8, that's fine. Now we have rook f3, not only trying to get to the queen side or to the king side, we could even bring the other rook over if necessary. So king h8, they know things are going to get a little bit weird on the king side. So rook c1, look, open file, queen d8, and now the queen is attacking h4. So look at this move, king to g3. So it's a very interesting move. It looks like the king is getting exposed, but I don't see an easy way for the black pieces to do anything. So the king is now supporting h4 and f4. That way the queen can come over and attack. So after king g3, queen b8, guys, there's not much more they could do as the black pieces. So queen b4, look, we're using the dark squares to penetrate. This bishop is not able to do much. So rook g8, then queen d6. Guys, we're happy to trade queens because then our rook gets to the 7th rank. That's all we want. So of course they did not take. They went queen e8, then rook c7. We're penetrating again through the dark squares that the bishop cannot control. So bishop c8, we get rid of this rook, and now the other rook comes over dark square, 7th rank, and this is just too much. So after rook c3, queen e8, rook c7. Now guys, if they had done something like rook f8, just trying to put pressure on f4, we could just go king h3 and we're going to be fine. If they ever take, there's no check, so we have a skewer. All right. So just in case you were wondering what what to do if they had done that. So instead they went queen e8. Our rook goes to the 7th rank, of course. Rook g7, and now we have knight b5. Very nice move, guys. They cannot even take, because we're going to be taking on c8, and they're just going to get in a lot of trouble. So after knight b5, a6, now another nice move, queen c5. We ignore that, we make this available for the knight, and we put in pressure with this battery on the bishop. So after queen c5, rook c7, we have to take with the knight. And then after queen f7, guys, there's a nice tactic here for the white pieces. So pause the video and see if you can figure it out. Well, the move is knight d5. I know the knight is way better than the bishop, but that extra pawn is going to make the difference. So taking right now is just a very easy win. We hit the king. We have our protected pass pawn. This pawn is not going to go anywhere. So of course they did not take. Instead they went bishop d7. Now look at this knight, f6. So you see the knight is going to another dark square that cannot be attacked by the bishop, and that knight has pawns in the center to help him. So the knight has very nice outpost. So after knight f6, we have bishop c6. Finally the bishop gets active, but it's a little bit too late. So queen d6, then h5 for the black pieces, king h3. Look, just trying to do g4. Guys, we cannot have such a powerful knight and stay there doing nothing. We need to push, create more weaknesses, more ways to get in and help the knight. Use the help of the knight to attack. So after king g7, we finally break on g4, bishop f3, and now after we take, they take, we have queen d3. Look at that queen using the help of the knight. So bishop g4. At this point, the white pieces took, and only now we trade our powerful knight for the bishop, because we get a pass pawn, we get a way better position. So after king took, king h6, now we have queen d8, king h7, queen f6. Guys, if they trade, this is a very easy king and pawn endgame to win. So queen g8 check, we block with the queen, they go to c8, and now after h5, queen c6, trying to do some checks, we have check, and our king goes to g5. Now our king cannot be bothered by that queen. We could easily go to h6 or f6 and simply help our queen deliver checkmate and win the game. Now I was not that interested, guys, in this final part of the game, but I really wanted you to see how they went from this position that many people just cannot come up with the right plan. Let me see, yeah, right here. Yeah, oh, a little bit more. Okay, from the moment they took on e5, they already had the ending that they wanted. They wanted an end game where they had a knight versus a bishop, and the whole strategy, the whole transition from middle game to end game was based on that. So guys, I hope that this lesson was not that boring. I know that studying this is not as exciting as doing tactics and playing games, but it is extremely important. It could change your game dramatically. This is the lesson that you want to go back to it in the future, review it again, look at more games, study this material. But I think that next time you play your game, before you trade a knight for a bishop for a knight, that you're going to think carefully and you're going to have more information to make the right decision. So like always, I know there are things left, many doubts, so feel free to leave me in the comments any questions that you might have. And with that said, I will see you guys next time.